Hello, this is Anjana Meenakshi for the News Minute. We are in Hyderabad Sundarayya Vignana Kendram this Sunday because K Balagopal, the civil liberties activist's 15th memorial meet, is being celebrated here. And joining us today in a very special interview is Professor Achin Vanaik. He's a retired professor of global politics and international relations. And he has authored several books, including The Painful Transition, Bourgeois Democracy in India. And he will be speaking to us today on the very same topic on which he gave an address a few minutes ago. It's on Palestine and the genocide in Palestine. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. All right, so we'll get right into it because we are discussing K Balagopal, who's a very well-known name in the Telugu states. And he was a huge civil liberties activist, but he had written a piece in Telugu on Palestine, which was one of his few pieces which wasn't translated, but he had basically said that we have seen countries like China and Vietnam where you see people fight because they have the land beneath their feet. But Palestine is probably the only place which has witnessed en masse a fight where the fight is for the feet beneath your ground itself. So that is the distinction he made, that you can fight because you have the ground beneath your feet on one hand, like in China or Vietnam. And then sometimes the fight is for the land itself. So I'd like to start off by asking you to ruminate on this or just talk about what you think.
Well, I think his point is, of course, that you have a settler colonial apartheid state which has taken away the land of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are really fighting for their own territory, for their own right of existence. Especially now, because the nature of the genocide that is taking place in Gaza can only be understood if you realize that a section of the Israeli leadership is seeking to eliminate Palestinians as a people. So this is not something that China or Vietnam had to face in quite the same way. And this is something that makes the Palestinian struggle for its very existence as a people something very distinctive. I can add here that you have a peculiar motto of the Zionist, historical Zionism, which did not apply to China or Vietnam, which was that there is a land without a people for a people without a land, which is a completely misrepresentation. And don't forget, in 1969, Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, said there is no such thing as a distinct Palestinian people. Actually denying the existence of the Palestinian people in a way that you did not find, for example, in China and Vietnam. And that's kind of thinking is one which leads to a degree of dehumanization and leads to a justification for the kind of genocide that Israel is practicing against Palestinians.
Right. So, one of the things I was also hoping to ask you is we don't want to go too much into the history because you did spend the last 2 hours speaking about the genesis and the history which led to the Israel Palestine conflict and the genocide in Palestine as we know it today. But one of the things I do want to talk about is India because that is what directly impacts us. That's what we would care about, right? So, from 1948, after independence, where we were heavy supporters, we had leaders who were heavy supporters like Gandhi of the Palestinian cause, so to speak, to today, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government. What is the major ideological, political, and diplomatic change you see? If you can comment vis-a-vis that, is there a change in how we have looked at the morality behind the issue itself?
Well, what you have from the time of Gandhi till, say, Narendra Modi, you also had a certain change in the Indian government's attitude towards Palestine, where earlier there was a combination of moral sympathy and support, political diplomatic support, and a certain degree of realpolitik. This gets, so if you like, there is a phase from 1948 to 1950, where when Nehru recognizes Palestine, recognizes Israel, and then doesn't really follow up on the establishment of full diplomatic relations by subsequent governments until 1992, when you have the Narasimha Rao establishing full diplomatic relations. After that, and this is of course after the Oslo Accords, you have the Indian government's position under Congress and other governments. Uh, More and more the direction of paying lip service to the Palestinian cause and giving money either to the Palestinian Authority and to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, till you have Vajpayee government coming in.
Okay.
And then the Vajpayee government shifts even more towards Israel. Even during the 1992 to the Vajpayee government, you find a shift increasingly towards further collaboration with Israel, even by the Congress government. This accelerates during the Vajpayee government. That dynamic continues with the 2004 to 2014 Congress government, and I can give you details about that. And then there is a certain qualitative leap in the relationship between Israel and India after Modi comes to power.
Okay.
So,
What would you say, broadly speaking, would be the really drastic changes in the last 10 years? Because that is what we're talking about under the current incumbent government.
well, what happened is that maybe the point can be summed up diplomatically and politically by what Modi did in 2017, 2018, and subsequently. In 2017, he became the first Indian Prime Minister to officially visit Israel. During the Vajpayee regime, you had the first ever visit of an Israeli Prime Minister to India.
And that signifies some friendship.
That signifies a change. You're actually now talking. Whereas earlier, we never had this. Hmm? What you did have, which is indication of the changes, was the first ever meeting of Israel and India's Prime Minister, which took place abroad in Rajiv Gandhi's time in 1985. You have under the non-BJP United Democratic Government (UDP), not UPA, the
UDF.
UDF, sorry, United Democratic Government. You had the first ever visit of the President of Israel, Weizmann, to India. Then have a leap forward by Vajpayee, in which for the first time the Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, the butcher of Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon, make an official visit to India. And then you have Modi in 2017. For the first time, the Indian Prime Minister visits Israel, signs three deals, numerous deals to consolidate, and does not go to Ramallah and the occupied West Bank. In other words, dehyphenating Israel from Palestine and making it very clear that Israel is more important. And then in 2018, what does Modi do? He went to Israel for 3 days. He goes to Ramallah for 3 hours. And there, for the first time, you have a significant shift in the official declaration and position of the Indian government towards Palestine. He comes out with the general statement that India supports the creation of an independent and sovereign Palestine. But for the first time, two omissions. He no longer talks, the Indian division does not talk about a united Palestine. And it does not, for the first time, talk about East Jerusalem being the capital of this Palestine. East Jerusalem is taken over, forget it. United, well, what Israel has done is actually cut up even the West Bank completely, separating Gaza and all. And by omitting the word united and omitting the word East Jerusalem, what is he doing? He's accommodating himself to the Israeli reality, and in fact saying that if you have some Bantustan kind of agreement, so we're fine with it. So there's a very important diplomatic political shift in the position he took. In 2018, he also omitted the word viable, united viable, but the word viable was restored later on, but not the word united and not which was always there before, that East Jerusalem should be the capital of Palestine.
So
And of course,
it's
dramatic escalation of relations, arms, this, that, etc.
yeah. So I mean, it's interesting because I also did read your a lot of your writing, but one of the main things I read was Dr. Vanaik's piece for the Caravan, where he speaks about how the events of October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel and 1,200 people died, the Indian government did decry that as an act of terrorism, but they have not mentioned whatsoever anything to do with what has been happening since then till now. So that is one of the things you also mentioned, and you speak about how the language has changed so much and how what we decide to condemn and what we decide to conveniently ignore. One more thing, you said this during your speech, and I couldn't help but think to myself, this is our critique of how right wing politics have played out in India. But in your speech, you said that the Soviet Union, while Czechoslovakia supplied arms to Israel, India and the leftists in India did not criticize it whatsoever because the Soviet Union was doing so. So, what has been broadly the left's attitude, the Indian left's attitude towards the Palestinian cause?
Well, the problem is that the Indian left has been progressive as compared to other political forces and all, and of course its stand on Palestine today is much, much better than that of all the other political parties. Yeah. But you're talking about the early period when the Soviet Union was the first country to de jure recognize Israel. And that had to do with this assumption that this was a labor Zionist regime and that it was against Britain and supporting it would weaken Britain and so on. But so that when Nehru recognized Israel, the left did not make any kind of a fuss against that. The left in India has taken very rightly so, very critical positions against imperialism of the US and so on. But it has often tended to generally tail end either the Soviet Union of the past or China's Maoism. So it is much more reluctant to criticize those countries. Of course, the Soviet Union subsequently became moved in the context of the rise of Arab nationalism, the recognition that Israel was aligning itself very much with the Western imperialisms, moved towards a much stronger position of support for Palestine and against Israel, and therefore the Indian left also followed that, as well as, of course, having sympathy for the Palestinians.
Okay. So, one of the things I also wanted to discuss was the fact that, I mean, there is a genocide. There are a lot of lives which are being lost on a day to day basis. But the one thing which an ordinary Indian is likely to ask is that, on one hand, and you mentioned this in a lot of your writings, is also that the Congress, the UPA government, was criticized for taking a slightly more pro-Palestinian stance, in the sense that they valued ideology over pragmatism, as opposed to how BJP is valuing and how Modi's Gujarati dialectical mind has been so influential, so to speak, in ensuring that we have a very pragmatic relationship with the country of Israel. This is broadly speaking the true camps in which people find themselves. But how would you
I would say that it's not correct to say that the Modi government has only a pragmatic relationship with Israel. It has, in fact, a much stronger ideological affinity than previous governments, including the Congress. The Congress, of course, aligned more towards Israel for much more pragmatic realpolitik reasons, while the Modi government and the BJP has a pragmatic realpolitik dimension which influences thinking. It also has a stronger ideological affinity between Hindutva and Zionism.
yes.
Right? So you also have that dimension, which is not there in the other political parties, and certainly not in the left.
Okay. So, what would you say if you could draw parallels between, if we have to put aside the leaders in question, but if you had to draw parallels between Hindutva and Zionism, what would you say are there, considering how they've changed and evolved? Both ideologies have changed and evolved. What would you say are the similarities and the contrasts?
Well, I have four basic similarities. Both ideologies and supporters of those and parties and groups that support the ideologies both have a respective myth of origin myth. The Zionists say that Jews were the original inhabitants of that part of the world. Well, Judaism and what are called the tribes, the Israelite tribes, really emerged in the late Bronze Age, which is roughly 1500 to 1800 BCE. And the Judaic faith really emerges as a result of a conversion of a section of prior Canaanites. And even if you read the Old Testament, you will find that they talk about the Philistines and the Jebusites and the Canaanites, and then there were the Amorites, and even before that, 4,000 years ago, you had the Phoenicians and the Babylonians. So the idea of Jewish tribes being the original inhabitants is totally wrong. In fact, insofar as these Jewish tribes are part of Asia, West Asia, you have to ask yourself, where did the European Jews come from?
Right. And
Right.
how does Hindutva work in that?
Right. In the case of Hindutva, they also have this myth of Aryans being indigenous and the Aryans being original. And there, of course, and they actually trace also late Bronze Age. The Vedic age is roughly the same. If you look at the Vedas, they're the oldest. They are also roughly in the same period when the Israelite tribes are formed. Yeah. But then they have to deal with the whole question of the Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and the Indic civilization, which they then have to claim is somehow Aryan and all that. And you know that the genetic work as well as linguistic work and historical work renders that ridiculous. But that is not stopping that kind of thinking from being taught in universities and schools, although no so serious historian will take that. So that's your origin myth. Second comparison is the foundational exclusivity. A foundational racial exclusivity, which is, of course, the exclusivity as seen of being anti-Muslim and anti-Islam in Hinduism. Now, this is a charge I make, and not just I make, lots of people make. You have to see for yourself and their behavior and their ideology, what you think about it. This is the view that many of us have had. And in the case of Zionism, it's foundationally anti-Palestinian, not anti-Muslim, but happy to piggyback on current Islamophobia, which benefits them. So you have a foundational exclusivity in that. There are two conceptions of nationalism. Hinduism are the essence of nationalism, and Jewishness is the essence of the Jewish state. And I've always said that when you talk about nationalism, there are two ways that you can talk about nationalism. You can either see nationalism as an inheritance from the past, in which case there will always be dispute about what is the proper inheritance and who are the proper inheritance. Or you recognize that nationalism is what we will make of it. It belongs to the present and future. And it is up to us to make it a much more secular, humane, and democratic nationalism. But unfortunately, people want to claim that nationalism or the nation is something very, very old when it is not. For example, you had no real concept in India of the past of the citizen. It was always the subject, praja, not nagrik. The notion of citizen comes in modernity and is intimately connected with the notion of a nation and nation state, because the nation is supposed to belong to the people. So, and the state is a nation state. So that's the second discussion on the exclusivist nationalism. A third is the myth of perpetual victimhood. Hindus in India have been the victim of invaders, of suffering from so many others, and so on. And of course, Israel's perpetual myth of victimhood. The fourth is the question of the Jewish right of return. All Jews all over the world can return and live in Israel with full rights, which are denied to non-Jews living in Israel.
But how would that apply in India?
In the Indian case, it's not quite that same matter, but you have, if you like, the development very recently through the CAA, the Citizen Amendment Act, of a kind of qualified neighborhood right of return. Now, just notice something about this CAA. It says that all non-Muslims, they say non-Muslims, to include Christians and Jews and all Jains, which are hardly there. But it provides a kind of cover up for their central preoccupation with the Hindus and Sikhs and Jains. And it's interesting that Sikhs and Jains, even though Sikhs are rebelling about it, are seen as part of the wider Hindu fold.
Yes.
Right? But leave that aside. They're saying that non-Muslims are, by the very nature of being non-Muslims, religiously persecuted in the three majority Muslim countries of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and therefore have a right to fast track naturalization. Right? Now, isn't it interesting that this does not apply to Ahmadiyas, Muslims, but because they are persecuted in Pakistan, or to Hazara Shias. But the most interesting aspect is that you have a Hindu community in a neighboring country which has also been oppressed and persecuted, but they don't get fast track naturalization. You know who they are? They are the Tamil Jaffna Tamils.
Yeah.
They don't get fast track naturalization. Now, why don't they get fast track naturalization? Because then you would be indicating that a Buddhist majority country oppresses. And if you're saying that a Buddhist majority category oppresses, no, then you are opening the ground for saying, well, then even a Hindu majority country, Hindu could be guilty of persecution.
And then you can't circle that square.
So we just confine it to these three Muslim majority countries. They get that. So the purpose is not so much a concern about that, but to get across this idea that Muslims and Muslim majority countries are by their very nature persecuted.
There was a slight change of plan because Sundarayya Vignana Kendram has a series of speeches and a major chunk of many of Hyderabad's residents have turned up for it. So we had to ask our final question to Sir outside of SVK. So just one more thing we'd like to ask you. And we are seeing the conflict increasing. Less than a week ago, Iran attacked Israel. Several ballistic missiles were launched. And this is in retaliation to the fact that Israel killed the leader of Hezbollah. And now with more and more countries involved, I just have one thing as an Indian, I think a lot of people would like to know. What is the moral and the most practical stand, if there is one stand which the Indian government can take right now, vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine? What would you say that would be?
First of all, recognize that by killing Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, it is Israel that is the actor and has violated the sovereignty of another country. And it is after that that Iran has responded to what is doing over here. So the other point, of course, is that there's also the whole question of what Israel is doing in Gaza and all, and others feeling the need to support. And then, of course, you have the pagers and all that being finished off, which is another sort of assault on the sovereignty and people there. And then you have Hezbollah also doing like that. So understand here that the fundamental culprit is Israel. Having said that, nobody benefits from this war getting extended or expanding. I'm sorry, I said nobody. Yes, Israel thinks that it can benefit from that. And it's also conceivable, and they must be having discussions, that the United States thinks that since very few people are objecting to it and nothing has really been done in terms of sanctions or whatever against Israel, maybe this is a way of rearranging the whole of the West Asian situation in a way that will geopolitically benefit the United States of America. Because the United States of America is concerned about Iran's influence in the region. It has other Arab governments concerned about it. So insofar as this can weaken Iran, there's something that the United States could well say, okay, go ahead. Plus, the other aspect is that although Israel has nuclear weapons, it doesn't want other countries not only to not have nuclear weapons, it doesn't even want them to have the potential to have nuclear weapons, which you automatically have if you have nuclear energy. So when the Obama deal took place, which most people said at least has prevented a bad situation from getting worse, in the sense that Iran has agreed not to have nuclear weapons, and there's a deal even as it can develop its nuclear energy infrastructure. Israel at that time was opposed to that deal because it doesn't want countries to even have the potential, although it itself has it. And they say- So now it wants to create a situation where the other countries will go along with it, attacking the nuclear facilities of Iran. In fact, having to read the latest reports of what Trump has said, Trump has been saying, yes, do it. I mean, what is going on here?
Yeah.
I mean, so this is a point that is there. Plus, of course, on the question of Lebanon, there is a violation of Lebanon's territoriality in the sense that, of course, not only does it have to ship off arms, but it now wants to take a large chunk of South Lebanon, and is continuing with this massive assault, which airstrikes which are killing innocents at an enormous scale. And here's where the question of language comes in. We do not have a universally accepted definition of terrorism. Hmm? And different countries have their own definition of terrorism, which makes it convenient for them to say that we are not terrorists, they are terrorists. Huh? But a simple, basic definition of terrorism, if you like, which could have very widespread examples, is the threat or killing, the threat of killing or the actual killing of innocent, unarmed civilians. If we can accept that, then of course you have non-state actors carrying out terrorist acts and threatening that. You can claim that Lebanon, Iran, by sending missiles, etc., threatens the existence of civilians. Huh? But how on earth can you let Israel off the hook, which is carrying out a scale of terrorism? And how can you let states off the hook doing that? Yeah? And even here it's a selective. We'll have countries, a country that you probably know of, which will say that Pakistan is a terrorist state. But India, no. And Hamas is terrorist. But Israel is a terrorist state? No. Al Qaeda is terrorist. But the United States, which has killed more civilians outside of its borders since 1945 than the rest of the world's countries put together, that's not guilty of terrorism. So just labeling somebody as terrorist becomes a justified for wiping out. What happened in my time as a young person when we were told that it is better to let 100 guilty people go free rather than threaten or hurt one innocent? Now it's the other way around, isn't it? Kill 100 innocents or even more because you are getting one terrorist. And that terrorist is not a proven terrorist. It's you are acting as judge, jury, executioner. And this kind of thinking, this kind of is terrible. It can only create a kind of escalation of this. If you really want to move towards sanity in this part of the world, recognize that the biggest culprit in all this is the Israel, and the biggest victims are the Palestinians. And if there is a just resolution of this issue, things can change much for the better. But we cannot separate Israel and the Palestinian issue from all the other things that are going on, even though other countries also have their own other motives. And it's not as if many of these countries are that concerned about the Palestinian. But when I say that, I mean the governments of these countries. What you do have in West Asia is among the population of these countries deep sympathy for the Palestinian cause. And this is something that worries the governments there because they are dictatorships and they're worried about the democratic dynamic of support for the Palestinian cause for justice and rights, which also means that there's a fight for rights and justice in these dictatorships.
Thank you. Yes.
I want to add one simple sentence that sums up, if you like, the whole fundamental problem here. And that is the Israel strategy with twists and turns can be reduced to one simple sentence: more land and less Palestinians. If you cannot expel them, kill them.
Well, thank you so much, sir. And that was Professor Achin Vanaik. He's been speaking tirelessly on this issue for a very long time now, and this extensive writing, which I would highly encourage everybody to look up. I'm Anjana Meenakshi for the News Minute, and please don't forget to subscribe because stories like these are what change and influence democracy. Thank you for watching us.